All right, test. Good. So I'm Dimitri. I'm one that behind the back of the Bunny account, and what we have here is kind of a breakdown of how I perceive the dynamic between the state and DeFi ultimately playing out, and why I don't think anything we're seeing so far is surprising, what you can expect to see more of, and what you can expect as far as the outcome. And you'll see some, original memes here to kind of amplify the point. So crypto, I view fundamentally as a disintermediation of state control of financial infrastructure. DeFi is a separation of finance and state, which really up until recently wasn't feasible technologically. Like you needed that, the state's rails to facilitate commerce. This is what we're doing is more than innovative technology insofar as what we're accomplishing here. I perceive that it's probably going to keep getting worse insofar as the US response to this stuff, but I see our eventual victory as pretty inevitable, and I draw from what I view as compelling parallels historically on that. So, the US is still the world's sole superpower. As much as it does seem to be declining, it's still the man in the room, and in large part it exerts its political will via proxy wars and financial wars, relies a lot on sanctions, dollar diplomacy, SWIFT, etc., to kind of impose its geopolitical will. So this is kind of a form of soft power, and it evokes this soft power through the institutions it created from Bretton Woods, essentially, the IMF, things like that. So it controls the rails geopolitically, internationally, in large part, and it also controls itself domestically by way of the banking system, which are effectively public arms of the state. Banks are not private entities in any meaningful way. They are arms of the state. They could fire their entire executive team if they wanted to today. They dictate capital controls, things like that. So banks are public entities. So the US kind of runs things through these two mechanisms. And DeFi, as its kind of sole essence, undermines the US's ability to assert itself internationally and domestically by incrementally causing it to lose control of the financial system. In fact, it's kind of the point of what we're doing. And so part of my framing of this is almost to kind of have you commiserate with the other side. Like, imagine if you were the US. How would you perceive this technology? Is this helpful to me or not? Is this accretive to my control, or does it take away from that? So I'm not saying sympathize with the adversary, but understand the lens through which he views you. That's very important. Now, know your enemy. Permissionless, anonymous transactions in a network controlled by no one is entirely antithetical to the foundation of the US-controlled financial system. Everything's permissioned, KYC'd, et cetera, in TradFi. What we're building is definitionally, it's the opposite of that, okay? Your financial existence in TradFi is a privilege. It can be revoked, it can be frozen, you can be kicked out of the system if they want. With us, it's a right. It's the baseline. It's impossible for us to kick you. These are very contrasting ideals coming head on. And this is a big deal for power and control of, the fundamental kind of way that information is relayed, which is how I view money and finances. It's economic information. Everything we tout DeFi for, and this is again like another kind of thing to help illustrate this, everything we tout DeFi for, the state hates it for the same reasons. What we think are strengths, they view as problems. I view these as irreconcilable differences. Like there's no middle ground here, unless we just fundamentally distance ourselves from kind of the core tenets of what we're building, which I don't think is a tenable solution. So power is a zero-sum game, and what we're building takes from that. And what I think is the proper framing here is, how would you anticipate a drug cartel responding to another smaller cartel settling in its territory? I mean, would you expect the smaller cartel to appeal to some kind of legal precedent, or say, hey, Sinaloa cartel, this is a capitalistic market, free exchange of ideas? Like, no, that's going to get you taken out pretty quickly. Like, mafias behave to kind of control and own their territory. And I know this sounds like a kind of Orwellian description of the US, and I understand it's not just that, but again, from this dynamic, I think it's appropriate. And, you need to remember when you're appealing to this kind of legal framework, the state creates the laws, interprets the laws, and enforces the laws. So we're at a very structural disadvantage here in terms of how this works, and they can change the laws as they see fit, and as they often do sometimes. And I don't think relying on jurisprudence made before computers is a very reliable thing to us to bank on. I don't think that's going to save us. And also on an aside on the legal stuff, Coinbase had the legal team of God, and they still got a Wells notice, right? And God knows they did everything to kind of avoid that. They're still getting gone after. And I've never seen interagency disagreement before between the SEC and the CFTC. The SEC thinks everything except Bitcoin is a commodity, is a security. Everything except Bitcoin is a security, and the CFTC thinks ETH is a commodity. So agencies don't even see eye to eye on this, and the best legal teams you can hire are not really protecting you here. So again, this is kind of game theory, I think is the right way to view this, not some kind of legal lobbying approach. And just on an aside, when the US wants something, it just does it. It doesn't ask for permission, it asks for forgiveness, and it doesn't even ask for forgiveness. It just does it. There are plenty of precedents of this for things it finds to be particularly important. Guantanamo Bay, MK Ultra, Epstein, the Iraq War. We just declare war now. We just don't. The Senate's supposed to have to ratify that. Whatever. Okay, no, it's fine. The president just does that now unilaterally. The Senate should have to ratify treaties. Whatever. We'll just join the Paris Climate Accord. That's rules. They're becoming more and more parchment guarantees, is what the founders would call them, which is to say just letters on paper that aren't really upheld. And a good parallel for this is the USSR. The Soviet Union had a much more expansive Bill of Rights than the US. It codified far more freedoms and certain delineations and carve-outs. It doesn't matter. None of those freedoms were given, but it looked lovely on paper. And I'm just, parchment guarantee type of thinking is what you see here when the US really wants to do something. And the media mostly runs cover for them. So, what are you going to do about it? And some reframes I see kind of often of the US will always figure it out and, it'll do right, I think is very historically nearsighted and parochial and doesn't kind of see this from a cyclical type of approach that it deserves to be seen from. Crypto is built very different, not to meme that phrase, but it is. And I think people who kind of mock, no-coiners who mock us as distributed databases, I think unknowingly kind of mock their own understanding of what this is for human coordination. This is the first form of human coordination writ large that doesn't use violence or the state. And I'm a little repetitive there because the state just uses violence. So this is the first form of human coordination that doesn't use violence. That's a very powerful concept. And I think if you only see this through a very reductionist lens of financial transactions, you're just we're trading online. I think you're kind of viewing the internet as something that just sends emails. It's a very narrow application of something that it does when it was much, much more for information propagation. And crypto cannot, DeFi, I use DeFi and crypto interchangeably, by the way. And Urbit to me is part of this sphere. So, Web3, and I'm going to define Web3 here, but to me, by the way, I'm using these terms kind of interchangeably. Crypto cannot be seen from a normative lens of innovative technology to how the state will view it. We are not building, new SaaS tools or something. This is not, a new go-to-market, how does your recurring revenue service work sort of product here. You need to understand, and this is a really big thing I want to touch on, and I'm going to touch on right now, is the huge substantial difference between third industrial revolution tech and fourth industrial revolution tech that I just don't feel people touch on ever. So the third industrial revolution versus the fourth. Fourth industrial revolution tech is inherently political. And this is to say DeFi, Web3, crypto. And by Web3, I mean a peer-to-peer interactions, essentially, that allow you to circumvent gatekeepers, so to speak. Web2, don't be evil. Web3 can't be evil, is how I see that. Not as a VC term, Web3. I think Web3 is, it's the best term we have to encompass all that. So fourth industrial revolution tech is inherently political, as opposed to third industrial revolution tech, which in all the industrial revolutions before it, frankly, washing machines, steam engines, whatever. For third industrial revolution, internet, microprocessors, smartphones, these are pure magnifiers of productivity and efficiency. Who doesn't love that? And they were great for individuals, they're great for corporations, they're great for the state, everyone won. They're very everyone does better that way. As Steve Jobs would say, they're a bicycle for the mind, which is to say, that was his really nice way to illustrate that technology allows you to accomplish things more fluidly, conveniently, succinctly. Everything before us did that. It was built to enhance efficiency. And this is a core point. All of this stuff is accretive to the state and to corporations. It helps them. Fourth industrial revolution is not. In fact, it kind of bakes in inefficiency sort of as its underpin. Like, why are we decentralizing a database? Like, why do that? Why not have it in one? Like, that's more efficient. Like, we're baking in things that inherently detract or add friction to how these things work because of what we're removing from the equation when we do it. Fourth Industrial Revolution tech exists to disintermediate existing structures of control of compute and finance, control over compute and finance. It removes gatekeepers as its essence, as its core motivation. It is detractive to the state and corporations. As this stuff proliferates, it does not help them. It doesn't help them. So understand, again, know your enemy. How are they going to view you? Not positively. I wouldn't, right? That's totally rational for them to view us that way. The very nature of what we're building implies political action, and this will require certain forms of political coordination and messaging. As much as I'm not really a fan of that, I don't think we need to politicize anything any more than it is. I hate that too, but it's the nature of what this is. It just is, and pretending like it's not doesn't help you. It's imbued with political essence, as political control as its very nature. And something I'm going to talk on later in a panel, is part of this. And you are building cool tech, but you are not just building cool tech. It does more than just, it's more than just cool tech. Another framing here: the U.S. is a young country. I'm in Europe right now, so I don't need to sell you guys in this, but it became the #1 economy around late 1800s, 1890ish, and it became the preeminent superpower towards the end of World War II. So we're talking about 78-ish years here. 78 years. One industrial revolution it led, and then San Francisco and some of the stuff it's built has been very impressive, right? What the U.S. has built and accomplished is, it deserves recognition, but it doesn't have some kind of historical cycle here that's just hey, this fourth turning cycle will be different. The U.S. is going to buck this trend. I'm not seeing that. There are U.S. senators older than the time the U.S. has been a superpower serving now. It's been the #1 economy for about 1.5 human lifespans. I don't think there's context here on it figuring out or bucking any kind of historical patterns we've seen. And this is what informs my game theoretic view here that low-intensity warfare is, is the appropriate framework for how we're going to be perceived and treated. Understand the U.S. more as a cartel, defending its hegemony, as it should. Again, totally rational for it to do that. And understand how it will deal with us as a result of that for the threats we get there. And I don't think, and this is a big one for me, U.S. hostility is not occurring because there's an educational gap. I see comments on that sometimes, we need to send in more lobbyists and really help them understand. No, I think it's the opposite of that. I think they are starting to understand. 3 or 4 years ago, no one gave a shit about DeFi and crypto. DeFi wasn't even really a thing. It's because they just saw tokens bouncing around. They didn't care. But now they see, wait. We see what this means for transactions and maybe, tax collection and other things and money remittance. Wow, we care now. So I think it's the opposite. They do understand because they do dislike it because they are understanding. And I'm going to touch on some examples here. You should expect a lot of slanderous nonsense. This is an example from what prosecutors said about one of the Tornado devs who was detained illegally 3 or 4 months without any charge after Tornado was sanctioned for writing anonymizing code. You just held for 3 or 4 months, just life ruined, on hold, whatever. This is what you're up against. And and their argument was this guy with this skill set can only do more illegal things. Okay, it's not even worth arguing. You just understand what you're dealing with when you see language like that. And the U.S. is not going to come out openly and ever say this is a power thing. You're going to see headlines with, again, pejorative, stupid, fluffy stuff. The crypto is harmful to minorities and people of color. Everything is racist. That plays pretty well. Whatever. And then you see a climate example that you can just pick out. You can just pick these examples out of a hat for what they're going to go with that day. And remember, the political language does not need to be true. It needs to be effective. And what this does is it post hoc justifies actions they want to take already. And it basically allows them to at least not lose votes. Maybe they won't gain it, but they're not going to lose it because, hey, this has a reason that is legible and understandable to them, and there you go. So that's the point for it. Don't argue with this stuff on its nominal terms. You're just going to lose brain cells, and it's just going to waste your time. These aren't real arguments. They're just post hoc justifications. Why DeFi can't be defeated, though? Because, I sound pretty black-pilled here and bearish for its presence, especially in the US, but I'm actually not. That's more of a near-term thing. Near-term, maybe less than 10 years, give or take. I'm not really predicting a timeline there. But in a longer timeline, I'm very sanguine and white-pilled on this. And I draw inspiration from Guerrillas before us. And why does the U.S. Why won't the U.S. stop DeFi? To me, it's the same reason it really doesn't win wars anymore. The U.S. has been very successful historically in combat, but who does it defeat? It defeats the USSR, Russia, China, Germany. And what kind of foe is that? It's very legible. It has a hierarchy of command. It occupies territory. It has identifiable military targets. The U.S. crushes that. Very effective at that. Okay, who does the U.S. lose to recently and is routinely just spinning its wheels? Goat herders and rice farmers. That's a little bit of an asymmetry. Like the military, the SEC, and regulators everywhere, this isn't, SEC and all regulators, are built to go after the same thing as the military is in this example. They're built to regulate Goldman's, Barclays, Deutsche, Fidelity. Again, these are very legible, centralized entities that occupy territory, office buildings. They have a chain of command. Let me speak to your compliance department. Let me speak to your executives. You can manage that. You can control that. You can see it. You can observe it. We are not that. We're not that at all. Why can you still use the Pirate Bay? They wanted to shut that down forever, just Hydra's head, because you can't stop peer-to-peer networks unless you want to go full China and then some. And then it's mask off, and I don't know about you, but I'll move. I have no allegiance to the U.S. in that respect. Kind of pains me to say that, but they've beaten it out of me. It's because you can't stop peer-to-peer networks. You really can't, unless you want to shut down the internet or something like that. They're not capable of going after millions of us across the globe in a cryptographic network. Just the raw resources and competence are not there. And this is kind of the energy I'd like to see adopted a little bit more, and not to be belligerent. We don't need to be antagonistic to the state, but more so understand, the upper hand you kind of have here. View yourself as the meme I put out online, the on-chain rice farmer. You are armed with cryptography, ZK tech, AI, VPNs, very well funded. And with all the intellectual capital, they're not sending their best. I don't know, the best minds don't go to work for regulators. I'm not really concerned for us long term. The crypto conflict, to me, this is why it resembles low-intensity warfare. Like guerrillas before us, we do not occupy territory. We don't have centralized structure of command. Targeting us is very hard. It's difficult. You'll see some displays of force. Some heads will go on pikes. It's an intimidation tactic because they can take down some people. I don't know. I don't think they're going to take down Vitalik, but maybe like Hayden Adams, Andre Cronje, right? Someone who's very visible and gets some, fear of God into you. But there's too many of us. We're ants. You can't crush them all. We are a legion, and the U.S. has had a very hard time with this kind of adversary historically. And something to draw from here that is really important strategically, even if militarily inferior and indefatigable foe can outlast and win against an adversary that isn't fighting for survival. And this is where I think motivation's playing into it. I've written about this in other parts of the series. But when you're fighting for something you believe in, or fighting for survival, but fighting for something you believe in, your motivation to fight is much more intense and persistent than if you're just fighting for control. The motivation behind that matters, and I believe we have the dominant motivation here. The superior force will eventually capitulate, fighting an unwinnable war that their livelihood isn't staked on. When the U.S. wins this war, I see it as mostly becoming the UK with the Second Amendment. That's not a life or death scenario for the U.S. It just stops becoming the arrogant superpower it can be, but it still has a good standard of life and living. It's not going to be destroyed. And so I think that motivates the fighting intensity dramatically so. And an example here from the Vietnam papers and from the CIA. It was exposed 70% of the reason we continued to fight this war was to not be embarrassed because of losing to Vietnamese farmers. And what did? We ended up quitting. We want this more than them. We're more sophisticated, robust, and well-funded and coordinated than guerrillas before us. And we have the dominant motivation. And this is a quote I really like from Henry Kissinger. The conventional army loses if it does not win. The guerrilla wins if he does not lose. You just need to not die. There doesn't need to be a crushing blow here. There doesn't need to be a Mike Tyson punch. The U.S. does need to deliver a Mike Tyson punch. We don't. You just persist. You will fatigue war of attrition the other side out of existence, and it's worked historically. It's leaving Afghanistan after how many years? It's just we're not winning this. And really, do we care that much? We're going to get embarrassed for a couple weeks, and then life goes on. Whereas we would care. the essence of an industry I care about deeply would die. Like, I'm not just going to leave that. So again, just don't die. This line is, that quote is very compelling to me. And so now on to the El Salvador method. I'm going to touch on kind of how I see network states manifesting and some core concepts that I think are important to keep in mind. So some main ones that I want to touch on that I think are kind of very orienting here. On-chain networks are trustless, but off-chain ones are not. The best societies are high trust. I mean, if you go to the US, you'll see why that is. Many of them are not high trust. Having spent some time in the UK for a month last month in a smaller town, and like, you know, I've lived in lots of Airbnbs and stuff in like, you know, rural Maine, things like that. You can see the stark difference between a high trust and low trust society. And the second part, code is not law. Like, it's just not law. Men with guns is law. Men with guns will always be law. And that's just how it works so long as you don't, you know, have a physical body. Whoever can put you in a box creates the law. So this is very important for where we can set up shop for these network states. The cultural and infrastructure changes that need to take place to kind of galvanize this relocation for people for like DeFi tier autonomy, there's going to need to be some changes to kind of orient that, and this is what I think there'll be. And on an aside, this is going to be kind of what I touch on too at the panel later on at 4:30, so plug, I'll be down there talking on like urban adoption and stuff like that, that's tangential to this. DeFi will become a form of identity similar to other tribal ones, meaning affiliation with crypto will carry similar optics or, you know, things you can read into as nationality or political ones. I actually think I'm being kind of redundant differentiating between political affiliation and DeFi. I think they will converge as if you have this kind of belief in certain levels of sovereign finance, you obviously align with something else politically. And I view this as a form of costly signaling, as a trust communicator. So as DeFi gets demonized, it becomes more or less a casual hobby and more a commitment to ideals. DeFi becomes a heuristic that a person has a set of beliefs with you that align with your own. And I think tribal trust like this is necessary to form and orient these communities. The most powerful movements have this kind of very shared trust dynamic and ardent belief in what they're doing. And kind of as a good example, I would illustrate Urbit here. And what's the Venn diagram of an Urbit user and a Reddit user? I mean, I don't think there's much crossover there. I can probably predict 85% of the people's political ideologies here just by the very nature that they're here. If they have a planet, I can probably predict 93% of them. So, you know, that's powerful. It's not a bad thing. In fact, it's a very orienting thing that I think we should play into more. And again, not to inherently politicize something you don't need to, but that's already there. It's there, so recognize it. Web3 native tech stacks need to take center stage, and this is where I see Urbit as being very critical to this. To me, ETH is the financial network. Things like Filecoin and Arweave are the storage, you know, cloud compute network of sorts. Urbit is the communication and internet application network. Like, these are all part of a sovereign tech stack to me that kind of work with each other and are synergistic and have the same kind of ethos to what they're providing. And these need to take center stage both because it's a good thing, and I also think it'll become a necessary thing. And this is something I've written about for a bit. I fully expect big tech and cloud providers to turn on us when the state makes them. Sort of like Operation Choke Point 2.0. You know, right now it's easier for them to ID banks and on-ramping. But if you're, you know, a fair amount of ETH is, I believe validators and nodes are leverage AWS in some respect, the validators anyway, I think. You know, you can just change the laws. Now you're a money transmitter. Now you're something that requires formal registration, documentation. You think AWS or Azure are going to want to touch that? Like, no, it's easier to kick you off. So I fully expect them to kick us off one of these days when the US tweaks what money transmitters mean or whatever game they play to make it a liability to work with us. Same way it's a liability for banks to kind of work with us right now, right? And again, I think this would be something that really speaks to when you see someone working on this, you'd be like, wow, you know, this person, I can identify with this person in some respect. And this is an area I disagree with Balaji on his belief that crypto communities will be geographically decentralized, but ideologically aligned. I don't think the geographic decentralization thing is plausible. Where your physical body is matters, and the place with a monopoly on violence can't dislike you. Unfriendly countries are just not going to allow parallel economies and financial networks to exist in their borders. Like, it's just not, you're going to have to work with them. You know, it's going to have to be a mutually beneficial engagement. we help you by bringing in wealth, whatever, and then you allow us to exist and, provide protection, whatever. Like, you don't hate us. It matters a lot. The territory you live in cannot be hostile because men with guns are law. Geographic proximity is necessary for things like, again, we're physical beings, so we need to coordinate things like, food and what have you, real resources. I want to touch on this a little bit more. So yeah, things like goods, food, like Maslow's hierarchy style needs. Like those need supply chains and things to coordinate and set up. DeFi with the ability that allows us to do that, but that's why I don't think this geographic decentralization is really that plausible. Like, you need to set up infrastructure to feed you, to house you, to things like that. Again, we don't exist on chain, we're not in the metaverse, so that's why that really matters to me. And also, on an aside here, I don't think any of us are enlightened enough to escape this human imperative to form tribes and engaging in real life. I mean, why am I here? Like, I get a far better reach on Twitter and sharing this stuff online. There's, I don't know, maybe like 60 people in here. Right? Like, from a pragmatic standpoint, I should be spending it just broadening the reach, but there's a reason why I'm here. It's because this interaction is satiating in a certain way from a human standpoint that we all understand and like doing, right? It's cool seeing the faces and what have you behind all this stuff. You're not programming that away. Technology facilitates the human condition. It doesn't change it. You're going to need like 50, 60, 70 years for that to evolve away if that's the case. It's not going to happen anytime soon. And I don't think my emphasis on the physical element contradicts the network state part. Because I do not think a network state is something built atop a network. I think that's just a very flighty idea. It's a state facilitated by the network. It's a state that exists because DeFi and urban, these infrastructure things, allow it to exist in a new way, unencumbered from regulatory pressures and Western things and stuff. Like that, to me, is a network state. Who wins as the U.S. loses? We'll find home in places that are not, that as U.S. obstinance grows, we're going to find homes in places that understand this win-win relationship. Nation states will emerge in these friendly states and coordinate to bring in us and resources, and I don't think this would be possible without DeFi. So some examples on who's going to come to the front. El Salvador seems to be a very prominent one. A very prominent example of a poor country taking itself very seriously, going out of its way to signal friendliness to our kind and reinvent itself. And I have some other examples enumerated here. I'm not married to any of those, but I feel like several of them will probably come from this list. Vietnam might strike again, some parts in South America, things like that. Basically, poorer countries that see a way to gain, are not necessarily aligned with the US and the West in general, and see an advantage, see an opportunity for arbitrage. I think there'll be more El Salvadors. And this kind of speaks to the El Salvador method. I anticipate more El Salvador-style crackdowns on crime and violence to attract Western talent and improve the lives of their citizens. I think Nayib Bukele has changed the Overton window on what is acceptable. We all knew it was doable. Like, no one's surprised that when you stick the military on a gang, the military won, right? That's not surprising. But what did change is like, okay, now the framework has changed of what's palatable, what sells. This sells. Bukele's like 97% approval or whatever, The only one with more approval than him is Kim Jong-un, right? North Korea. So this works and people don't hate it. Leaders are going to be more willing to impose this kind of martial law style crackdown against crime. And I think the hunter will become the hunted. El Salvador is gaining a lot of ground. I will probably visit there next year. I know several guys that already live there. And network stakes, I think we're going to be kind of fine with these methods. They don't particularly offend me, especially when you consider it's all opportunity cost, I guess. What's the alternative? The alternative is the US and what they're doing, or this kind of monarchical authoritarian force that targets directly crime in a way. They have to suspend their constitution, but for what effort? I don't think they're going to target me with that. To me, San Francisco is a leading indicator for the US in a way that's just not encouraging. And closing up here on off-ramping, why? I don't want to off-ramp. And kind of to draw an analogy here, and I think this parallel is important because I think this is how we sell normies on this. Whenever you transfer money with Venmo, Revolut, your bank, it gets just a ledger update. It's a centralized ledger changing my ownership to his ownership, data entry, that's it. When you transfer money on a blockchain, that's all we're doing here. So once you draw parallels with people like, hey, you're already okay with this. In fact, you do it, you just don't know it. Here's a better version of the same thing. I don't think normalizing that would be particularly hard. And once people kind of get that, I don't think off-ramping, I think off-ramping continues to be something that's not that prevalent. And even on the retail, the big boy side, the Eurodollar market is just ledger movement. Backed by dollars, it's not even backed by dollars, they're rehypothecated like 9-10 times the dollars that are apparently housed in banks. No one collects any cash. It's all ledger movement, and the big boys are fine with that. It's a massive market. God knows how many, maybe 20, 30 trillion. Like, there's no real clarity on the size of that market, but it's all ledger movement. So this has precedent, and people are okay with it, big and small. And yeah, network states, we're not going to need off-ramping, and when people get it, I don't think that's a problem anymore. So in DeFi's early generations, blockchains decentralized finance, and in its later generations, blockchains are going to decentralize societal coordination, and it's going to facilitate trustless economics and on-chain, and trusted human coordination off-chain, and I'm very excited for it, and that's why I'm here, so that's it.